rotate. Slowly pitch up to 15 degrees. V2. Positive rate, gear up. Raise the landing gear by pressing the G key.
Orbit 526, contact departure.
Orbit 526, switching. Okay, move the stick to adjust pitch to 10 degrees nose up on the primary flight display, and raise the flaps. Reduce thrust to about 80% N1 to keep our speed below 250 knots. Climb and maintain 6,000 feet. Edinburgh departure, Orbit 526 with you, climbing to 6,000.
Orbit 526, roger. Orbit 526, turn left, heading 270.
Left to 270, Orbit 526. Okay, it's time for the turn. Make a nice easy left turn until our heading is 270 degrees. That's due west. Level off at 6,000 feet and reduce thrust to about 60% N1. That should give us about 250 knots. Let's run through the after takeoff checklist. Landing gear, up. We'll stay low on this short flight, so don't exceed 250 knots and keep the landing lights on. This is standard practice below 10,000 feet. Flaps, up. You're over-controlling. Use less pressure on the stick.
Orbit 526, resume own navigation.
Retract the flaps. Press F6 3 times. Resume own navigation, Orbit 526. All right, we've been told to resume our own navigation. This means the controller will no longer be giving us vectors, and we should follow our filed flight plan. Thrust set to 80% N1 for the climb. After takeoff checklist complete. Our flight plan route takes us to a point that will line us up for an approach to Glasgow's runway 23, which is currently the active runway. You can use the mission compass to navigate to that point, or you can follow our flight plan on the map page of the navigation display. You're over-controlling. Use less pressure on the stick. The pink line on the screen is the path we should be following. Assigned altitude. Descend to 6,000 feet.
Expect vectors for the visual approach, runway 23 at Glasgow. Glasgow altimeter 29902.
Slowing to 210 and we'll expect the visual for runway 23, orbit 526. Bring the thrust back to about 50% N1, then adjust it to maintain 210 knots. Since the weather's good, the controller will line us up with the runway and give us clearance to proceed to the airport visually once we have the runway in sight.
Orbit 526, descend and maintain 3000.
Descend and maintain.
526, turn left heading 230, vectors for the visual approach runway 23, report the runway in sight.
Left to 230, looking for the runway, orbit 526. Here we go. Turn left to 230 degrees. We should see the runway straight ahead once we roll out. Okay, level off here at 3,000 feet and bring the thrust back up to about 50% N1 to maintain 210 knots. Okay, I see the runway. Press F7 twice to lower the flaps to 8 degrees. The flaps will slow us down, so bring the thrust back up to about 60% N1 so we maintain 180 knots. Approach orbit 526 has the runway in sight.
Orbit 526, cleared visual approach runway 23.
Cleared for the visual, orbit 526. Reduce thrust to idle and begin descending towards the runway. Lower the landing gear by pressing G and lower full flaps as we slow down. Press F7 3 times. In a large aircraft like this, the speed you land at changes depending on how heavy you are. At our current weight, our final approach speed will be 130 knots. Adjust thrust to maintain 130 knots as we descend toward the runway. You're over-controlling. Use less pressure on the stick. Glasgow ground, orbit 526. Request taxi to the gate.
Orbit 526, taxi to the gate.